Good evening, everybody. This is Tyler Danzel, Module 3, Special Education Interviews, and this is for EDL 853. So I teach at Derby Middle School in USD 260. For these interviews, I talked to Mrs. Mandy Rohr, who's our assistant principal. She evaluates many of our special education teachers. I spoke with Mrs. Michelle Sweat, who is one of our special education teachers, and she mainly focuses on reading. And then the paraprofessional I spoke with was Mr. Drew Dallas. A couple of things about Derby Middle School. We actually do not work with a special ed cooperative. We hire our own staff, so our staff members are USD 260 employees, and about 14% of our students have an IEP. First question, how are SPED students identified at DMS? So I just spoke with Mrs. Rohr about this particular topic. The whole process from beginning to end usually takes about a semester. It starts with a team meeting, a meeting of team teachers, and then a PIT team meeting. If a student is struggling, we start out by implementing lots of different interventions to try to help that student. If those interventions don't seem to be working, they'll be referred to the school psychologist for testing. Parent interviews are also part of the process. If the parent makes the request, there's a little bit different process there. They have 10 days to respond to that request, but then eventually the process follows the same steps. The most challenging part of their role in special education, Mrs. Rohr said when we aren't successful, especially with students with behavior issues, that really gnaws at her. Mrs. Sweat, our SPED teacher, said trying to get parents on board with helping their kids become independent. And for Mr. Dallas, he covers all 3 grade levels in our school and many different subjects, so that's a challenge for him. And he only sees most of his students once per day. The most rewarding part of their job. So for Mrs. Rohr, helping a student become successful and also being acknowledged down the road by a student for helping that student out. For Mrs. Sweat, it's also when a student is successful. And for Mr. Dallas, seeing a student accomplish something. And like Mrs. Rohr said, being acknowledged by that student both now and years later for the help that they received. So all 3 were pretty much in agreement on the most rewarding part of their jobs. What advice would you give to a future administrator as far as supervision of special education staff? So Mrs. Rohr said good communication with the staff is vital. For Mrs. Sweat, she would like an administrator to understand the difficult tasks that they have, because often the team teachers, when you get the team teachers and the parents involved, there's many different emotions associated with that, and just understanding that task that they have. For Mr. Dallas, he brought up the point of being willing to accept the use of unusual methods to reach students. It may seem unusual to an administrator, but if it's working, sometimes that's what the student needs. How do you work effectively with parents of special needs teachers? So for Mrs. Rohr, whenever a meeting starts, the parents are going to be there. They're very welcoming to the parents. They try to start the meeting out on a positive note, and of course trying to build relationships over time. For Mrs. Sweat, she tries to build a bridge early with the family, again building a good relationship there, and she seemed to think that if you build that relationship, everything else will fall into place. For Mr. Dallas, he doesn't have a lot of direct contact with parents. If he has a concern, he will take it to the teacher. If a meeting is called with the parents, he may be asked to give the parents input at that point. Working with regular ed teachers. So Mrs. Rohr said that the special ed teachers are part of the regular ed teams, so they're given time to communicate with the regular ed teachers about students. They also hold pre-IEP meetings. So before the actual IEP meeting, the teachers will all get together and discuss the student and what is going to be talked about at the IEP meeting. Mrs. Sweat provides the regular ed teachers with something called an IEP at a glance, which shows the accommodations that the student needs. And again, she mentioned the team time. That is very important in working with the regular ed teachers. And for Mr. Dallas, he brought up something that sometimes students will confide to the para rather than going to the regular ed teacher. There's sometimes a little bit better relationship between the student and the para than the student and the teacher. And he will then go to the teacher. So that open communication between the teacher and para is vital. What characteristics do you seek in aspiring administrators? So for Mrs. Sweat, she'd like for her administrators to be supportive of the SPED teachers and staff. And for Mr. Dallas, he would like somebody who is familiar with special education or at least willing to learn. How do they describe their role, or how do they describe the role of the special education teacher? For Mrs. Rohr, they are the teacher but also the case manager, and they have their students in their homeroom, and she'd like for them to get to know their students very well. For Mrs. Sweat, she described the special education teacher as the quarterback of the team. They're the ones that are leading the entire process for that student, and also as an advocate for the student. Mr. Dallas, he also described their role as being an advocate for the student and for the SPED staff. The role of the principal in the special education process. So for Mrs. Rohr, the principals are the legal education advocates for the students, and they must attend the IEPs. And she believes it's important to build good relationships with the families. Mrs. Sweat, she wants the principals to understand the process and also to support the SPED teachers. And for Mr. Dallas, he thinks principals need to understand the difficult job that SPED teachers have. And also how important it is to build a team among the regular ed teachers and the special ed staff. What advice would you give to a first-year administrator? For Mrs. Rohr, she said almost immediately said it's impossible to know everything that needs to be known about special education. So ask. You can contact the State Department of Education or a local service center. We're fortunate enough to have an administrator in the central office who is the special needs coordinator who helps with those things. And also to use common sense, very important. So my thoughts about my role as an administrator. So some of the thoughts that I've had throughout this class were kind of confirmed by Mrs. Rohr, Mrs. Sweat, and Mr. Dallas. And number one, we administrators must ensure that we are in compliance with all laws and regulations. We must ensure that teachers are maintaining fidelity with the IEP. They're doing the things that we legally must do for those students. And we need to develop positive relationships with the families of those special education students. Thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you later.